Aron Stubbins is a member of 3 departments. I think you are one of the few people, Aron, who has the trifecta landscape. He is joint between marine and environmental sciences, between chemical, civil and environmental engineering, and between, I got that right, and between chemistry and chemical biology. He's a fantastic colleague who is studying a number of things, but notably for today, plastics and the plastic cycle and the really important considerations that I think every single person around the civilized world is now aware of, that plastics are both wonderful and a problem. So Aron, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you as a colleague and in the college. And I am going to now, that's all I'm allowed to do. And I'm going to now turn over to Aron Tuttle, who is a PhD student and will do the honors of introducing you. So thank you so much for your time today, Aron.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Aron Stubbins, my PhD advisor. Originally from Wales, Aron received his PhD in marine biogeochemistry from Newcastle University in 2002, studying aquatic carbon monoxide derived from dissolved organic matter. Following postdoctoral studies at Old Dominion University, Aron held a professorship at Skidaway Institute of Oceanography at the University of Georgia before joining Northeastern in 2018. Currently, Aron holds joint appointments in the departments of marine and environmental science, chemistry and chemical biology, and civil and environmental engineering, as previously noted. He researches the natural carbon cycle with a particular focus on organic carbon and plastic-derived carbon, and mentors undergraduates and graduate students, such as myself, across a wide range of departments. So please welcome Professor Aron Stubbins.
Thanks, Aron. Thanks, Hazel. The introductions. So I'm going to switch to share slides now. And given the requested format, there's some introductory. You're able to see my cursor in this mode.
Great.
Okay, so yeah, so for most of today, I'll talk about plastics and that they're everywhere. And one of the reasons they're everywhere is that they persist by design. And so because of that, they've accumulated in the environment, and then they break down in the environment to smaller and smaller pieces and eventually dissolve. So today, plastics are pretty much, probably literally everywhere we look, in the true sense of the word, and anywhere we look, we'll probably find plastics now. In the air we breathe, in the water and food we drink and eat, etc. And as they move around the environment, they get degraded as well. And most of my work is on the physical side of this, so like how plastics get into the environment, move around and are degraded. But thinking about working with colleagues on plastic breakdown and human and ecosystem health impacts, then to understand human exposure, we need to understand where plastics are and what they break down into. So in terms of like distribution, we need to know not just that there is plastic somewhere, but what type of plastic it is, know its size, because its size impacts where it will be in the environment. Will it be suspended in the air? Will it be on the ground? Will it be floating, etc.? And so that changes exposure as well. And then we also need to understand its chemistry and also the chemistry of the byproducts released, because those will impact people and other things in the environment. And before speaking about plastics, given that there was a sort of bit of an introductory to the journey, then so as Aron noted, I grew up in Wales, and today happened to have daffodils behind me. They flower pretty late here, but in Wales they're the national flower, and grow around St. David's Day, which is in March, but spring's a little later here. Growing up in Wales, then we had this mixture of a landscape that was obviously shaped by geophysical processes. But then that's got mixed into the local myths and beliefs. And so I just wanted to show a couple of those because they kind of inform my thoughts about the world, and growing up in this landscape really got me into environmental sciences and marine sciences as well. And so here we have a Borth beach, and this is a petrified forest, so an old forest. And then here you see what looks like a gravel roadway going into the ocean. And so the myth around these features is that there's this sunken kingdom, and it was protected by this massive dike called sunbaked. And a prince, Sethnian, was in charge of like making sure that this dike didn't fail, and was protecting this massive forested kingdom, and went away drinking at night, neglected to close the gates, and then high tide came in and flooded the kingdom. And for anyone who wants to sort of see this landscape in more detail, then on Netflix, there's this video series called Hinterland. It's kind of a little bit like a Scandi noir, but set in Wales. And you can watch that either in English, or you can turn the subtitles on and watch it in Welsh as well. It's called a Gyre in Welsh. In school, so we would learn about all the local myths and how the landscape came to be from that perspective. But then in geography, we would learn about how it actually came to be and develop the scientific understanding. So these forests here are 4,500-year-old petrified forests that are preserved in the anoxic sediments that usually cover them. And then this, what looks like a roadway here, is actually where is a glacial deposit. So a glacier had stopped there and left this scree behind, and it formed what looks like a roadway, a gravel road going into the ocean. So you sort of grow up knowing the landscape and both versions of how they came to be. Other local places of note. So this is Cadaridris. It's a cool mountain fairly close to home. This is the River Dovey. It grew up sort of up this valley over here. And the myth of this valley, this little cum or corrie that a little glacier formed, there's a giant pebble which you can't quite see, or a giant boulder sort of the size of a room that you can't quite see in this photo, but it was meant to be in the giant's shoe. And this giant was meant to have sat down here and caused this indentation and taken that giant rock out of his shoe on his way to go and fight other Irish and Scottish giants, as they used to do. And then, yeah, obviously in geography, we would learn how these landscapes formed by a little glacier sat here. A glacier formed this lake here down below. And so we'd learn all that. And we were lucky enough to sort of know this landscape and grow up in it, but it'd also be in our textbooks as well. So it was pretty good being able to actually see the real world. And that's kind of carried into my science. Like I have a very empirical streak where I want to go to a place to make sure I understand it if I'm trying to study it. The reason I grew up in Wales is because my mum moved there to work at the Centre of Alternative Technology, which was funded in 1973 to show that you could live off the grid in terms of electricity, and because we needed to decarbonize the economy because climate change was coming. And so, yeah, this was set up as a visitor center. We lived in a village sort of nearby rather than on campus, but some people lived on campus using the local hydropower and windmills as well for power. And so that still goes today. And they actually have university level courses now on carbon-free living and other sort of aspects like organic farming and stuff like that. So I grew up with that sort of these perspectives of close tie to the landscape and this sort of understanding that the whole world was connected and changing because of human activity. When I went to university, I did marine biology. And what really, as well as like learning the things you might expect doing marine biology, and what really captured my interest was biogeochemistry, so the more chemical piece of that. And one of the founders of that science is Vladimir Vernadsky. And where in the West, then we think of Darwin, who taught us that life evolved, then Vernadsky put forward that life, the physical and the chemical environment, all evolved together. And we sort of understand that, I think, from most people will think of like major physical events that have changed the world and then led to the differences in the different species that live on the Earth. So we can think about a meteor strike, potential volcanic activity potentially doing in the dinosaurs. And we can, so that's really, you can see that a global scale of physical event can impact what organisms live on the planet. But the opposite is also true. Major evolutionary events can lead to major changes in the chemistry and even the physical landscape that we see. So things such as organisms evolving to produce oxygen through photosynthesis has oxygenated our atmosphere and completely changed the chemistry of the Earth, changed our chemistry of our atmosphere, ocean and land. And life, for example, has given rise to new geological features such as these white cliffs here on the south coast of the UK, formed by 70-million-year-old coccolithophores. So single-celled organisms have accumulated over time in geological time to form this landmass. So that landmass is a product of these organisms. So biogeochemical thinking really captured my imagination and led me on to study the carbon cycle for my graduate work and most of my research career. And the focus here is the carbon cycle. So one of the elements of interest in biogeochemistry, and particularly important element because it's the building block of life. It's also the element that we're digging up out of the ground and burning for fuel, and therefore increasing CO2 concentrations in today's atmosphere. And the organic carbon that's naturally produced by trees all the time and other photosynthetic organisms is the foodstuff for the rest of us heterotrophs. So it provides our food is organic carbon. And so there's a lot of reasons to want to study the carbon cycle. And so I've done work on that, studying how the natural carbon cycle is responding to human activity to see if the natural carbon will either act partially as a savior to sort of offset some of climate change, or if actually we're going to degrade the environment at a global scale and that will actually accelerate climate change. And to do that work, I've been lucky enough to get to see the world beyond Wales. And so to keep traveling and looking and learning about landscapes and how they function, done field work, saying this was local field work back when I was in Georgia, in the local salt marshes, but research in Siberia, in permafrost soils that are thawing as the Arctic warms, work on glaciers in Alaska and Tibet. About 6 to 12 months at sea added up. In this case, breaking ice off Greenland. So you get to see cool things like polar bears, as well as understanding the carbon cycle in the natural system. What used to be an exotic landscape, a New England river, before I moved here. And then the largest river in the world, the Amazon here. You can see the shore in this picture, but then there's some places where you can't. So this is, the biggest river in the world. It's 10 Mississippis, for context. And then other places in the ocean as well. And in all these places, we go and get samples and want to understand the carbon fluxes through them and also how the carbon is processed. So we do biodegradation experiments, but also photochemical experiments. And then we use analytical chemistry to understand both the amount of carbon and also what types of carbon are in the sample, and piece together global budgets of the global carbon cycle, global black carbon cycle, things like that. So that sort of is where the bulk of my research time has been spent during my career. But more recently, we started working on plastics. Postdoc in my lab at the moment, Li Xinzhu, is kind of instrumental in this becoming something we do. He was a graduate student when he visited my lab at the University of Georgia. And we started doing some photochemical degradation experiments, and my kind of interest grew from there in plastics. And you might think you've got this natural carbon. How does that relate to plastics? Well, plastics are just another form of organic carbon on Earth. And so the geochemical tools that I use and the type of field work and other experiments I do can be applied to plastics as well as to natural carbon to try and piece together the plastic carbon budget. At the global scale, my interest really got solidified actually teaching the class at Northeastern, where I teach about the global carbon cycle, global biogeochemistry. And then as part of that class, I had a couple of lectures on plastics. And that led me just to try and convert the plastic numbers into carbon numbers. And once I put them into that context, I really realized just how much plastic there is on Earth today. Like there's a lot, even compared to some of the natural carbon cycle processes that have been going on. And so the start of that process is this paper here by Roland Gyre, Jenna Jambeck, and Cara Lavender-Law. So they looked at how much plastic has been produced on Earth since 1950. And they use terms that we sort of use in biogeochemistry as well. So primary production is the production of the plastics. And so there's 8,300 million metric tons produced since 1950. Of those, about 2,500 are in use. Some is getting recycled, but most of it gets discarded and ends up in the landscape. Then a small amount gets burnt, incinerated as well. So those were the plastic numbers, but I wanted to know how that compared to the amount of carbon on Earth. So I wanted to convert this plastic number to a carbon number. And so to make that calculation, we have to pick, there isn't a really detailed budgeting of every type of polymer moving around the planet. So I just took the bulk plastic numbers and figured out a rough percentage to convert from plastic mass to carbon mass in that plastic. And so here's a table of some different polymers. So we have polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, which might be drinking bottles, PVC, and then polystyrene. And they have different percentages of carbon based upon their different chemistries. So depending on the chemical structure, then they have different, the percentage carbon by mass is different. But we took samples from the open ocean and we checked their percentage carbon, this mass of microplastics, and it was about 83%. And it kind of falls within the range here. So we just use this 0.83 to convert from how much plastic there is on Earth to how much plastic carbon there is on Earth. And that was good enough for the review and can only be refined if we know how much of each individual polymer there is on Earth. So once we've done that, we can convert from this plastic budget and compare to this global carbon budget. And so that conversion is just times 0.83. And then the conversion here, the carbon budget is usually presented in petagrams, whereas this plastic data was in 1,000 million tons. And one petagram is 1,000 million tons. So we just did those conversions. And so once you do that, we end up, instead of having 8,300 million tons of plastic produced, we have 7 petagrams of plastic carbon produced since by 2015. 2.2 petagrams in use and about 4 petagrams discarded as waste on the planet. That allowed this number to be put in perspective with natural carbon stores. So the ocean holds about 700 petagrams of dissolved organic carbon. So this is dissolved organic molecules in the ocean. Added up, that's about 700 petagrams of carbon. So a lot more carbon than there is plastic on Earth. Soil carbon, again, a much bigger number than there is plastic on Earth, 2,000 compared to the 4. But this number of 4 petagrams that has accumulated just since 1950 is actually about a third of how much carbon there is stored in all blue carbon. So blue carbon is carbon stored in coastal ecosystems. So plastics are accumulating. They're starting to become significant amounts of carbon on Earth. And when we think about this in terms of timeframes, then the natural carbon stores accumulated over thousands of years, whereas the plastics only started accumulating since 1950. That's kind of alarming. And we produced this plot in the review paper. And this shows dates starting in 1950, when really industrial levels of plastic production started. and moving through present day, the black data, and then extended out into just an extrapolation, the same fit through this line, just an extrapolation, assuming that populations keep growing and plastic production keeps increasing. So that might not be our future, but just gives us a rough idea of what might happen before the end of the century. And so looking at this, we can see that after just 12 years of plastic production, there was as much plastic carbon on Earth as there is human biomass. By 1994, there was as much plastic carbon as there was carbon in all living animals. And projected by about 2035, there'll be as much carbon on Earth in plastic stores as there will be in global blue carbon stocks. So this plastic's accumulating pretty fast. The other way to think of this is the annual fluxes instead of the net accumulation through time. And there we can really see how much plastic is being added to the Earth each year. So here, if we look at the latest data, which was for 2019 at the time, then about 0.34 petagrams of carbon was released as plastic into the environment in 2019, or produced in 2019, sorry. So this is the primary production. This is the polymers being produced before they get used, etc. So of that 0.34 petagrams of carbon produced in 2019, about 20% is incinerated, so just get burnt. And that ends up being 0.08 petagrams of carbon per year. And for perspective, that's only about 1% of all human fossil fuel emissions. So as long as there's no other toxic ramifications of burning plastics, as long as the fumes are dealt with, then burning plastic may be an okay thing to do with it if you get some energy out of it. If recycling is either not financially or energetically favorable, then burning it may not be the worst thing because it's only a little bit of carbon compared to how much CO2 we release from fossil fuel burning, etc. About 60% of all plastics produced per year end up being discarded. And this is about a quarter of a petagram. And that's a significant flux. So that number is greater than the carbon burial through natural processes in all inland waters globally. It's greater than the amount of carbon buried in the deep ocean per year. It's greater than the amount of carbon accumulated in all blue carbon systems per year. And that's today, that's this year. Whereas next year, there's going to be more plastic carbon released. The rate of plastic carbon released per year is accelerating, whereas the natural carbon cycle is kind of static, more or less. So that's kind of one of the more shocking things, is that there's just that much carbon going into the system each year. And so, yeah, from that sort of general realization, we developed this paper, which ended up as a perspective or review in Science last year, detailing plastics as a major part of the Earth system today, and that we need to think about them in the same way we think about other geochemicals, as well as thinking about them as contaminants, as potentially toxicants, etc. From this figure from the paper, then you can see that there's some numbers like the production of plastic and the plastic in use. These numbers are relatively good. But when you move into the environment and you're trying to figure out how much carbon is moving from rivers globally, how much is in the atmosphere, how it's been degraded, all that, there's just a ton of question marks on this figure. And there's some big ranges in some of the numbers, like 3 to 10 in terms of deposited along coasts. There's a lot of uncertainty in this global budget because we're only just starting to piece it together. We just don't have the empirical data. And we don't even understand the mechanisms at play in a lot of cases as well. And so this paper put forth this synthesis of data, but also led to a call for geochemists to kind of do this type of thing, to answer these questions, start to put together the global cycle of plastics, both as because that's of geochemical interest, but also because of the potential human and ecosystem ramifications. So at present, then we're doing work in the lab about how plastics move around the earth, where we find them, how they break down, what types of chemicals they break down into, as well as beginning research on which of those chemicals may be toxic to us or other organisms. And we also hope, as a larger group on Northeastern, to also start thinking about using Northeastern campus as a place to think about making the right decisions about plastic use as a society, but starting with that question on campus. So that's something we're trying to develop as part of the sort of plastic working group, is how to do that, what questions to ask, and sort of start to build that team as well. This is kind of a segue in the talk from very broadly how plastics move around the planet to a presentation on the photochemical work that shows that plastics dissolve in sunlight. And so if there are questions about plastics at large in the environment, this is a good time to ask them. Aron.
Oh, that's a totally ridiculous amount of plastic.
Yeah.
Is it a carbon sink? I guess maybe you're going to be getting to that in the breakdown products, but is it like actually?
No, because it's fossil fuel carbon, so it's just we dug it up, we made it into plastic, and then if it ends up buried again.
Do you see any hope for reuse, recycling?
So yeah, I mean, there's recycling.
I mean, can we do something about that curve going? I mean, can we just like flatten the curve?
There's lots of things that impact that curve in the same way as like the IPCC projections for climate, right? That's kind of a business as usual slope, which who knows if that's going to happen. If fossil fuel reduction, so plastics today are super cheap, and the fossil fuel industry kind of pushes their production because they're formed from its waste products. And so if fossil fuel production declines because of our concern about the climate, then plastics may become more expensive, and lobbying may decline as well for their production and use. So that sort of natural fall off might happen. Yeah, I mean, it's the discardable. So there's lots of cases where plastics need to are a good solution. Building materials, things that you want to persist for a long time, things that you want to be sterile and need to be sterile, like something, a medical insert, etc. It's the single-use packaging that we like, not so much straws and things, but all the packaging we use. It's just getting discarded every day. Yeah, so behavioral change.
I definitely did a lot of backsliding during the pandemic with my takeout containers.
Yeah. And
I think
masks
Hazel has a
and
question too.
yeah, hey, Hazel.
Thanks, Aron. I put a question in the chat, what's your view on how tractable plastics cleanup is? We hear about plastics cleanup and, vacuuming the ocean, which it seems a little science fiction-y there. And,
yeah, I mean,
do you think that this is tractable? Seems like good faith is not so bad, but actually, what do you think?
There's landscapes where cleanup would be good, like places where plastics get naturally accumulate, like there's trash beach in like Hawaii and other places where you just see they just like sediments build up in different places around. Then plastics are another sediment and they get washed ashore and accumulate in certain places, cleaning up in those like easily accessible and also human impacting landscapes where there's like a beach just covered, like literally covered in plastic. Then yeah, it makes sense to go clean, trying to get it out of the water, trying to make people keep their trash in the right place in the first place. All of those things are good, but going like vacuuming the ocean is not a tractable solution. Like the amount of waste and just physically the ocean is just big, and the plastic is not like accumulated in a patch size of Texas or not. It's distributed very broadly across the oceans, not in very high densities. And so it's just so much water to process. But yeah, it's such a waste of energy and resources. Yeah. But in places we really care about, like hotspots for biodiversity or human interest, or where it really accumulates, those sort of places, then yeah, we'll clean it up. But otherwise, try and stop it going in. Happy to move on. Just keep one window open. So if I don't have the chat thing open in this view, but I have like one viewer open. So if you ever, yeah, I think if someone puts their hand up or speaks up, you'll always pop into view. But I don't see the chats in real time, sorry. So what I've talked about so far is more like literature synthesis with a little bit of research we've done in the lab. Whereas I'm going to talk to about now is some of the first work we actually did on plastics and kind of got me thinking about plastics in the first place with Li Xin. So this has to do with how and where plastics break down and what chemicals are released. So this is Li Xin. He's a postdoc in the lab now. He was going to be here maybe like 2 years ago, but COVID came. He was a visiting graduate student when I was in Georgia. So he came and did 2 years in my lab then, and then went back to China to write up and graduate. And then he was going to come back and do a postdoc. But some of the research we're doing kind of follows on from stuff we initiated together. So yeah, perfect person to continue it. So luckily he was able to get back here eventually this January. And so he's in the lab at the moment. So yeah, he came to the lab to work on natural organic carbon, on black carbon, which is actually carbon produced from fire on Earth, and how it photodegrades in the ocean. But his lab in China does work on plastics. And so we decided to also photodegrade some plastics and see what sunlight did to them as well. And part of this was motivated by this very broad issue here, where we have 5 to 13 million tons of plastic going into the ocean each year. But when we look around the ocean surface, we only find about 0.25 million tons. So more than 90% of all the plastics that go into the ocean each year get lost. They're not found floating in the ocean. So some of them sink, right? So about half of it might sink based upon the types of polymer that go in. So some polymers float naturally, like polyethylene and polypropylene, they float. But other polymers, like even polystyrene, so when it's styrofoam, it floats because of the bubbles inside. But polystyrene itself, once those bubbles go away, it gets waterlogged and it will sink. And so, yeah, some of the plastics going in sink, maybe biofouling is one potential sink. So organisms might grow on the floating plastic and then sink it because of their extra density. And other plastics get washed ashore on beaches, as we kind of just talked about. You might find plastics being deposited on beaches. And so there's this flux of plastic into the ocean, but some of it just gets washed back ashore. But in addition to that, we thought the sunlight might also be removing plastics from the surface. And so this is the basic hypothesis. You've got plastics going into the beach, whether it's a large plastic, microplastic, or nanoplastic. As sunlight degrades it, and there's evidence or a long history of research on plastics being degraded by sunlight from the materials research literature. So back when people first started making plastics, they checked how well they resisted sunlight, so they knew which plastics to use outside, basically, and whether they needed to add any additives to stop the plastics degrading. So once you have plastics in the environment, if they remain in, say, the ocean surface or another environment where they are in direct sunlight, then they start to get brittle and start to break down as the photochemical reactions happen and they get oxidized. So they start to break from large plastic to microplastic to nanoplastic. But at the same time, they're actually dissolving as well. So just like, say, a sugar cube, you put it in hot water, it's going to dissolve rather than fragment. Whereas if you hit it with a hammer, it would fragment. The same sort of things happening. They're dissolving in sunlight and water as well as cracking and breaking down into smaller pieces. And they produce a suite of dissolved plastic byproducts. We can measure that total product as dissolved organic carbon. And this is actually a mix of complex organic molecules of fairly unknown chemistry and unknown health impacts. All these byproducts that are formed as plastics dissolve. We're studying this sort of in the ocean, but you can also think of this if there's plastics in the atmosphere, they're getting exposed to sunlight, and these same reactions are happening on their surface. And then if they get somewhere wet, they could then leach these organic molecules, say, into our lungs or stomachs or wherever they may end up after they've been oxidized in the environment. So back to the ocean, then there's two maps here. So on the left, we have the distribution of microplastics in the ocean. And this is for microplastics, so pieces smaller than 5 millimeters, and the number of pieces per kilometer squared. And you can see that they accumulate in these areas. So this is the equator running sort of that green patch through the middle of the Earth. And then this is the North Pacific Gyre. This is the North Atlantic subtropical gyre, and these are the southern gyres in the three oceans, the Indian Ocean as well. And the waters there kind of circulate round and round, and there's really low wave action as well, and so particles kind of accumulate there. They're big eddy systems, big gyres that spin round and round and kind of concentrate particles. So plastics naturally accumulate in those places, even in the southern hemisphere where there's smaller inputs of plastic. And then you can compare that distribution of plastics at the ocean surface with sunlight at the ocean surface. And so this is a figure for the ultraviolet light distribution on Earth, and about 55% of all the ultraviolet light actually falls in the gyres. And ultraviolet light is the light we protect ourselves from when we put suntan lotion on, sunscreen on, and we protect ourselves from ultraviolet light because those photons are the most powerful, most energetic. And so those are the ones that do the photochemical damage to our skin, and also the ones that photochemically degrade plastics. And so you have this overlap with where there's ultraviolet light and plastics at the ocean surface. And so in terms of just spatial distribution, then sunlight could be important in their degradation. So we got some samples that we then photodegraded in the lab. In this case, we didn't go to the Pacific Ocean. We found groups that had already been there and had archives of samples, and they sent us Sweets Algalita and the 5 Gyres Institute sent us plastics. And so here's a photo of the plastics collected from the surface ocean. And then we submitted them to Fourier transfer infrared spectroscopy and looked at their average chemistry. And so about 67% of these particles were made of polyethylene, and about 16% were polypropylene, and about 15% were a polyethylene-polypropylene blend. And this kind of makes sense. So here's the figure, and I just mentioned density a little bit earlier. This table has the buoyancy of some different plastics. And polyethylene and polypropylene, they have densities less than 1, so that means they'll float even in fresh water. Definitely float in the ocean, which is a little bit denser. Whereas PET, so drinking bottle plastic, is denser, so if you have a drinking bottle, a water bottle, if you were to completely fill that with water or take the top off and put it in water, it would sink, whereas obviously if it's full of air, it'll float. So you wouldn't really expect to find PET at the surface ocean. Same for things like PVC. And polystyrene, as I sort of mentioned, when it's foamed, it has really low densities. So a polystyrene cup, a styrofoam cup will float. But over time, quite rapidly, that sort of breaks down and it gets waterlogged in the same way that wood would. And once it gets waterlogged, it will sink because its density is actually greater than 1. The actual polymer itself is greater than 1. So once all those bubbles have gone and they're filled with water instead of air, then it will sink. So it makes sense that polyethylene and polypropylene are the two polymers found out in the open ocean, and that's consistent with other work as well. In addition to those samples from the open ocean, Li Xin cut up a polyethylene shampoo bottle, a polypropylene bottle, a styrofoam food container, and then we had some polyethylene standards as well. And so we cut those into sub 5 millimeter pieces to make some post-consumer microplastics. And then these were used for photochemical experiments. These photos here are actually from work at Northeastern conducted by Ariana Patterson, who's an undergrad in the lab at the moment. But we did the same type of experiment where we floated the plastics on water, and then we stuck them under a solar simulator, which has the same wavelength, the same light as we have in for the ocean surface, or if you were to step outside. We wouldn't use this as a tanning salon, but it's it's just like looking at the sun, or just the same as sunlight. And over time, we measured the release of dissolved organic carbon from the samples. So here you can see we have polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene. We exposed them to sunlight in the lab, and then we measured how much dissolved organic carbon was produced through time. And so that's how quickly, that's the carbon produced as the plastics dissolve into the seawater. We also counted bacteria by flow cytometry just to make sure the samples were sterile, and they were. And then we looked at carbon production through time. And so here's a figure for the dissolved organic carbon production. So this is the carbon produced as those plastics dissolve after through 70 days of irradiation. And a day here is about a day of sunlight in the gyres as well. It's about the same amount as light. So about the same amount as light as summertime here as well. The data here, the open circles are the dark control, and there's very low production of dissolved organic carbon in the dark for these samples, but there is production, 0.02 per day. And then in the filled circles, you see much higher production, and that's the light, it's the photochemical production. That's the data, the samples that were in the light. And that rate is about, that slope is about 10 times higher. So the slope there is 0.24, slope here is 0.02. So production is about 10 times higher in the light. When we look at this for the post-consumer plastics, where we know the specific polymers, we have two plots here. One has the polystyrene and the polypropylene on it, and then the other has two polyethylene samples. These are the same thing, the dissolved organic carbon production per day, through time. So you can see in purple is the expanded polystyrene. It has very rapid dissolved organic carbon production in the light, this solid data again, and the polypropylene has pretty rapid production as well. In the dark for both of them, we can't even see that the polystyrene is hiding behind these other symbols, the purple. But basically there was just zero production in the dark. And that was the same in the polypropylene. Polyethylene in blue, we saw production of dissolved organic carbon as well. But the rates were about 10 times lower. So you notice this scale goes from 0 to 5, whereas the polystyrene and polypropylene scale goes from 0 to 60. And the other thing we noticed here is that we see an increasing rate of dissolved organic carbon production through time. So the production of dissolved organic carbon, so the rate at which these plastics are dissolving, is accelerating the longer the experiment goes. And that fits with some understanding of how plastics degrade from the material science literature. So as they get oxidized, they start to become more and more photoreactive. And so their chemistry changes and they can absorb more light and they get more photoreactive through time. So their rate actually accelerates. So they go away faster and faster and faster the longer they're in the light. So we took this data and we used it we took the kinetics, the slopes here, and we used it to estimate how long a 5 millimeter piece of plastic would survive at the ocean surface. And using those exponential kinetics, so the kinetics that includes the acceleration in rates, Then the polypropylene and this polystyrene would go away in about 3 months or 0.3 years, 4 months, 3-4 months. And we have longer estimates here as well, 3 to 4 years, and that's using linear kinetics. So we just drew a straight line to get a more conservative estimate, so without the acceleration, to kind of bracket it, fast rate and a slow rate. So between 4 months and 3 to 4 years for a 5 millimeter piece of polypropylene or polystyrene to go away at the ocean surface. Polyethylene was much slower, with the exponential kinetics about 6 months, but up to 50 years if you just use linear kinetics. And then North Pacific Gyre sample, that data was linear. So if we go back here, the data was linear. So we didn't fit an exponential to that. We just used the linear trend. And so we only have one estimate, and that was about 3 years for that mixed chemistry polymer. So the basics of that, plastics, we think of them being super resistant, and they are if they're in the dark, say buried in soil or somewhere like that. But if they're floating at the surface of the ocean, and they're a relatively small piece with a relatively large surface area to volume ratio, then they'll go away relatively quickly. Within sort of months to years rather than thousands of years, like we might think of plastics persistent in the environment. And so looking at time, then we can. So yeah, from there, then from the first part of the talk, then sort of recognize plastics as novel anthropogenic, so human-made geomaterials, and that we should study in the same way that we study natural organics and sediments and how they move around the planet. We need to have a better understanding of this global plastic budget to understand the impact of plastics on humans and ecosystems. And then with respect to the photochemistry, then this dissolution, the dissolving of plastics, is much faster in sunlight in the dark, and it can explain some of the reasons why plastics go missing at sea, sort of a natural remediation process. And then I didn't get to those results, but the dissolved organic carbon that we see produced from the plastics is bacteria can just generally use it and remediate it, just use it like they would other sources of carbon. But in some cases, we find it to be bioinhibitory. So some polyethylene produces compounds that are inhibitory to ocean bacteria. And so that's more worrying. And ongoing work at Northeastern now with colleagues such as Zhenyu Tian and Loretta Fernandez describing the chemistry of some of these products produced as plastics dissolved to see if any of them are known or potential toxicants, as well as just describing their general organic chemistry.